Do you remember my Wily merchandise? Well, it's on sale now. Use the link in the description or the promo code on screen right now on Teespring and get 10% off. Go check it out. Now, throughout the years, we've seen one thing in almost every Zelda game: some form of time travel. For example, in titles like Ocarina of Time, Skyward Sword, Majora's Mask, and even the whole story of the franchise is tied together using time travel. And even in the most recent Zelda-related game, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, time travel plays a major role. However, in my opinion, Nintendo sometimes does it wrong. There are many examples of time travel ruining the story of a Zelda game, or even the overall story. So today we will look into all of this to find out how Nintendo uses time travel, what works and what doesn't, and some of Nintendo's biggest mistakes when it comes to this. Now let's dive right in. Time travel. This is an incredibly complex topic to talk about, so I will start this video off with a bit of a disclaimer. I'm not some sort of expert on this topic. I mean, I'm not an expert on any topic, to be honest, because this bad boy doesn't even have a degree except for a high school diploma. Hell yeah. So don't get too fed up when I say something you don't like or isn't 100% accurate. I'm also trying to keep this pretty straightforward, and I don't know everything. And to be honest, this isn't just a jab at Nintendo or whatever. There are many movies and games out there that use time travel quite poorly. It's just a difficult thing to work with, especially when it comes to the story. And another important thing to remember is how Nintendo uses time travel. They follow multiverse rules. This is a hypothetical self-contained plane of existence, coexisting with one's own, and a lot of them together is called the multiverse. Now, what this means is that every action can lead to a new world being created. For example, a universe where you had cereal for breakfast, and one where you had eggs. Both would result in a different parallel universe. They are alike, but in the end, also different. Basically, any choice could lead to a number of different worlds, all being different based on the choices that were made. Now, with that said and done, let's get into all of this. Starting off with the way Nintendo uses the whole time travel gimmick. This can basically be broken down into two types: using it to build, improve, or alter a story of sorts, and as a way to spice up gameplay. Now let's start off with the very first type. What does this even mean? How has Nintendo used or portrayed time travel in the stories of their games? Well, for this we will look at the best example of Nintendo using time travel in order to create some sort of story. That example being the first 3D Zelda game of the franchise, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. And I know some of you expected Skyward Sword, but we'll get to that one later on. Now in Ocarina of Time, the world is basically divided into two types: the past and future version of Hyrule. In the game, after retrieving the 3 spiritual stones and playing the Song of Time in the Temple of Time, you can take the Master Sword out of its pedestal. The reason you did this was to prevent Ganondorf from reaching the Sacred Realm so he could get his hands on the triforce. Because, simply put, the triforce is incredibly powerful, and without it, he can't take over the world. However, as we later find out, there's a bit of a problem with this master plan. Because Link is actually too young to use the sword, and so he's sealed in the Sacred Realm for 7 long years. After that time, he finally awakens again, but this time he isn't some 10-year-old kid anymore. Now, he's an adult. Well, mostly. But sadly enough, in that time, Ganondorf was able to get the Triforce, and while he didn't get the whole thing, he did get the Triforce piece of power. This already gave him enough strength to take over the whole kingdom. And in this new future timeline, there are many changes, with dire consequences for nearly all of them. Firstly, and most obvious of a change, is Hyrule Castle, home of the royal family, and now it's in ruins and scarred, resembling a fortress of evil. And another thing you will discover quite quickly is that the once lively and lovely town that's located close to it now lies in ruins and is filled to the brim with evil undead monsters, with not a single living soul in sight. Now, having said that, it's not all doom and gloom, because after you clear the Forest Temple, you can return to the childhood era from 7 years earlier by putting the Master Sword back into the pedestal of time. And from this point on, you can freely travel through time between Link's childhood and his adulthood. 2 worlds that are quite different, to be honest. The first half of the game, where you are just a kid, you learn about Ganondorf and try your best to stop him. And for a very long time, you had the idea that collecting the Master Sword and accessing the Sacred Realm was the way to win. However, in the end, this isn't the case, and you get to witness the horrors of Ganondorf's evil reign. Aside from this, they also did this for gameplay reasons. However, we will get to that later on. What I want to point out here is how it helps the story of Ocarina of Time. And this is actually a good example of time travel making a story richer. You get an example of what the world would look like if you failed. And in the end, you fight Ganondorf at full power, which is also cool. Now, in the end, the story wasn't perfect, but we will get to that later on. First, we will move on to the other type of time travel use. Gameplay. For this one, we will look at Majora's Mask. Here, Link only has 3 days to save the world of Termina from a moon that's gonna fall. And it's all because of the villain Skull Kid. And so, in order to pull this off in the game, you can play the Song of Time, to go back in time up to the very first day to prevent the moon from crashing into Termina. And you can use this over and over and over again to complete every task so you can stop the Skull Kid. And to help you, you can also play songs that skip time or slow it down. This way, getting around becomes easier, because as you can imagine, the events seen in those 3 days are always the same, unless you get involved. So in this game, time in general is incredibly important for the gameplay. Sure, story-wise it plays a role, but it's not that big. When it comes to completing side quests, unlocking certain extras, and even finishing tasks like dungeons, time is a lot more important. The clock is constantly ticking, and you need to use your time wisely, because you will have to redo it all if you don't finish it in time. And so, time is everything. Sometimes it's smart to skip ahead, while other times it's better to slow it down so you have enough time. And all of this even makes the world more lively. There are people running around with a job, schedule, purpose, and things to do. And all of that is one with the game's gameplay. And we see something like this in the second half of Ocarina of Time as well. Here, certain tasks can only be performed as a child, and certain tasks only as an adult. Items such as the slingshot can only be used as a child, while items like the bow can only be used as an adult. So now that we understand how it all works, let's go over to the next point. What works and what doesn't. Here things start to get really complex. And of course we will start with some examples of how not to use time travel in the story of a video game. And for this I actually have 2 examples. First of all, the ending of Ocarina of Time, which created the mess known as the timeline split in the Zelda franchise. Here, Ganondorf loses to adult Link, and at that point, Nintendo does certain things to end the story that makes everything more complicated and even creates plot holes. And thanks to all of this, the story starts to fall apart. Zelda instructs Link to place the Master Sword back in its pedestal and close the Door of Time, closing the road between the 2 timelines. After this, Link returns to his original time, and he retains the knowledge about Hyrule's fate. And so he comes up with the genius idea of visiting Princess Zelda and telling her everything in order to prevent it all. Now, if you think about this for a couple of seconds, then you will realize that this exposes all the things that don't make sense when it comes to the game's story, while also creating a complex mess that eventually affected all the other games. Now, I will mention some things that are wrong with ending the story like this. I won't cover them all, because then we would be here for hours. One of the most obvious flaws is, why didn't Link go back before to warn Zelda of what was gonna happen? He could have gone back at any time and warned the royal family of what Ganondorf was even doing. So that is a huge plot hole already. And I know what some of you will be saying. When Link went back, Zelda was still there in the courtyard. That's why it was possible. Well, maybe. I mean, he still went back in time using the Master Sword. Zelda even mentions that at the end of the game, so it shouldn't make a difference. But let's completely ignore that, because now we reach our second problem. Why would the King of Hyrule believe Link and Zelda? They are kids, and they have no proof as far as we know. Zelda's dad even trusts Ganondorf because he swears allegiance to the Kingdom of Hyrule. So how in God's name is the word of 2 10-year-olds enough? Zelda even told her dad about the dark dream she had, and he didn't believe her at all. So what changed? Clearly this doesn't make sense. And then we reach our third problem. Why did Zelda send Link back and close the gate between the 2 timelines? Doing this caused all kinds of problems in the whole Zelda timeline, which made everything a whole lot more confusing as well. And if there's one thing you don't want, it's a confusing story. Because thanks to that happening, there was no hero in the timeline where Link saved the world as an adult. And so Ganondorf was able to return in the Wind Waker and almost take over the whole land. And Zelda knew this was gonna happen, because Ganondorf said he would come back, and she mentioned it at the end of the game as well. So it was dumb of her to do so. And aside from that, what happens in the adult timeline doesn't really make sense either. Apparently there's no Link because he went back in time and warned Zelda, creating another different timeline. However, that doesn't work either. There must be another Link out there. Because if the one from the adult timeline is missing because he was sent back, there must be a second Link in the timeline he was sent to. It's a completely different parallel universe with its own Link and Zelda. Otherwise, it would just be the earlier years from the adult timeline, which would mean that the outcome of Ganondorf taking over wouldn't exist at all. And that's all because Link prevented it from happening by passing on the information and stopping it all before it happened. And so the events we see in the adult timeline don't happen. Link prevented it. And if this isn't the case, then he's in a new timeline, aka the child timeline, which should have its own Link and Zelda as well. Because otherwise, there wouldn't be a missing Link in the adult timeline. To be honest, time travel is a blessing and a curse, because it can be used to fix almost any problem. And in order to get the point across even better, I think I need to show you a short section of the Rick and Morty episode, Rattlestar Rick-Lactica. So here it goes.
Okay, so what are we doing?
That book has everything they need to create Snake time travel, and they're getting it in 1985, Snake time. Now they're gonna do it so early that it won't involve us, and they're gonna be even stupider with it.
Huh, and then what?
We're removing ourselves from this sloppy, f***ed up story and letting Snake time travel eat its own tail.
In short, all of this doesn't make sense. And I haven't even mentioned the downfall timeline, where Link dies during his quest, which could have happened at any time to be honest. And all of this led to Nintendo's biggest mistake, the Zelda timeline as a whole, which doesn't make sense at all. It functions like a multiverse, which means that every different outcome could lead to a new split. But in the end, Nintendo only acknowledges a total of 3, but in reality there are probably a billion, because even Link's deaths count. And then there are a million other possible differences that could create more splits. Like Zelda failing somehow, a certain character deciding they won't help, a specific item failing or reacting in a different way, things breaking like Link's gear, and way more. Heck, there should also be an extra timeline where Link does go back after winning and he doesn't tell Zelda anything. Because in a multiverse, that would also need a new separate parallel universe. Clearly, thanks to the world working like this and Nintendo setting it up in such a way, it all becomes more confusing, filled with plot holes, and problematic in general. This was by far the biggest mistake Nintendo has ever made. And then I haven't even mentioned the clear split at Skyward Sword when Girahim uses the Gate of Time, or the fact that they tried to solve this whole mess in Breath of the Wild by unifying the timeline because they mentioned all the timelines in one of the cutscenes, to then ruin it with another split in Age of Calamity. As you can see, even Nintendo doesn't know what they want to do with the game's story or the time travel scene in it. Personally, I find it all quite messy. There aren't many examples of Nintendo using time travel correctly. Well, unless you're talking about the gameplay, of course. And I think it would have worked out a lot better if they didn't go with a multiverse setup. So for example, in Ocarina of Time, you would still go to the adult timeline and see the horrors of Ganondorf. But after defeating Ganondorf, you get a solid piece of evidence so you can convince the king that Ganondorf is evil. And so you go back in time just like you did before and warn the royal family. Thanks to this, all the events seen in the adult timeline are prevented. And so, it disappears. That future has been prevented and is therefore not possible anymore or even relevant. It is literally gone. In my opinion, this would have worked way better than what they actually did in the end. It would have still had the same impact as it did in the original Ocarina of Time. However, in the end, the timeline wouldn't be as confusing. And it would also solve literally every multiverse plot hole. But be sure to let me know in the comments what you think. And don't forget, be sure to subscribe, leave a like to help out your boy, and be nice.